Transient objects in Hibernate. Now we are focusing on transient objects. An object is transient if it has just been instantiated using the new operator and it is not associated with a Hibernate session. It has no persistent representation in the database and no identifier value has been assigned. Transient instances will be destroyed by the garbage collector if the application does not hold a reference anymore. Use the Hibernate session to make an object persistent and let Hibernate take care of the SQL statements that need to be executed for this transaction. Here you can see changing new objects to transient state. Transient state is the first state of an entity object. When we instantiate an object of Pojo class using a new operator, then the object is in the transient state. This object is not connected with any Hibernate session. As it is not connected to any Hibernate session, so this state is not connected to any database table. So if we make any changes in the data of the Pojo class, then the database table is not altered. Transient objects are independent of Hibernate and they exist in the heap memory. There are two layouts in which transient state will occur as follows. One, when objects are generated by an application but are not connected to any session. The objects are generated by a closed session. Here you can see a transient. Transient entities exist in heap memory as normal Java objects. Hibernate does not manage transient entities. The persistent context does not track the changes done to them. In simple words, a transient entity has neither any representation in the database nor in the current session. A transient entity is simply a Pojo without any identifier. Here you can see transient employee entity here. Here Pojo interacts with the client. Additionally, we are considering here detached objects. Detached objects exist in the database but are not maintained by Hibernate. Detached entities have a representation in the database, but these are currently not managed by the session. Any changes to a detached entity will not be reflected in the database and vice versa. A detached entity can be created by closing the session that was associated with, or by evicting it from the session with the call to the session's evict method. Here you can see detaching an entity from session. Or here This temporary separation of the entity and database is shown in this image here. One reason you might consider doing this would be read an object out of the database, modify the properties of the object in memory, and then restore the result someplace other than your database. This would be an alternative to doing a deep copy of the object. Note that in order to make a persistent entity from detached entity, the application must reattach it to a valid Hibernate session. A detached instance can be associated with a new Hibernate session when your application calls one of the load method, refresh method, merge method, update method, or save methods on the new session with a reference to the detached object. After the method called, the detached entity would be a persistent entity managed by a new Hibernate session. Here Pojo interact with client. Here database interact with Pojo table. As an example, you can see this code segment. Here we are creating a new object for the employee class. Here is the code which allows which shows initialization of employee object. Here the objects arrived in the transient state. As an example too, we are considering at transient. Jakarta persistent annotations in mapping annotations. The at transient annotation is used to specify that a given entity attribute should not be persistent. The annotation type transient specified that the property or field is not persistent. It is used to annotate the property or field of an entity class mapped superclass or embeddable class. This is with regarding transient fields. As an exception example, we can consider transient object exception thrown when the user passes a transient instance to a session method that expects a persistent instance. This exception is in org.hibernate package. As an error example, we can consider this object references an unsaved transient state, unsaved transient instance. Now this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for watching it.